Security forces, elderly man, off plane. Then he makes one call and pulls $4 billion from the airline. Sir, you don't belong here. Please step off the plane. The words, though, spoken with professional calm, sliced through the cabin like a quiet insult wrapped in protocol. Malcolm Everett turned slowly, his weathered face lined with the wisdom and scars of decades past, his eyes meeting the flight attendants with a gaze that held no confusion, only quiet recognition. He had heard those words before in boardrooms, in banks, in the subtle glances of luxury lobbies, where his presence raised questions before credentials. But this time, the humiliation was public, deliberate, and it came at 30,000 feet before takeoff. JFK Airport bustled behind them, a machine of movement and murmurs, but inside Gate 21A, the mood thickened. The atmosphere in first class had shifted the moment Malcolm Tall, despite his age, entered in his beige trench coat and leather shoes, worn not from neglect, but from memory. He had walked the aisle with the precise steps of a man who didn't ask permission to exist. A man whose silence often unsettled people more than protest ever could. He had taken Seat 1A without hesitation, producing a boarding pass with the gold-lettered Priority Executive stamp. No one seemed to notice except the flight attendant Lisa Tremblay, who returned moments later with Officer Carson. Behind the thin veil of procedure, Malcolm could read the truth as clearly as a blueprint. He had become invisible again, not by accident, but by design. He glanced to his left as whispers swirled. A businessman leaned in toward his companion with a smirk, whispering, "Must have used points. No way he belongs in first." A white woman a few rows back clutched her purse tighter, glancing at Malcolm like he'd somehow snuck past the unspoken social filter they all lived by. But Malcolm didn't flinch. Instead, his hand reached into the inside pocket of his coat, not for ID, not for confrontation, but for a small folded piece of paper. He glanced at it briefly before sliding it back in. A boarding pass from another era, yellowed, ink fading. A handwritten note across it in elegant cursive. Our first flight together, 1987. Love, Ruth. His late wife's final flight before cancer grounded her permanently. That old ticket, a keepsake of love and dignity, was older than the plane he sat in, but somehow that paper carried more value than the uniformed men now telling him to leave. "I believe this is my seat," Malcolm said, voice level, extending his boarding pass. Officer Carson looked at it, then back at him, then to Lisa, who nodded subtly, lips tight with certainty. "Sir, we're asking you to come with us." Carson's voice remained professional, but the edge was there. Not a request, an extraction. A girl in row 2 watched with wide eyes, maybe 9 years old. She turned to her grandmother. "Why are they making the nice man leave?" she whispered. Her voice carried. It was the only innocent question in the room. Malcolm rose. Slowly, with the controlled elegance of someone who knew every movement would be judged, every gesture remembered. As he walked down the aisle, the silence grew heavy. Phones were lifted, recording. Some watched out of curiosity, others out of silent shame. He didn't speak again until he stood just beyond the cabin doors, the chill of the boarding bridge wrapping around him like the indifference he had faced all his life. He paused, looking back one last time, not in anger, but in quiet grief. He had once piloted machines far greater than this, fought wars for people who now questioned his right to sit in a seat he paid for. Malcolm reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, and dialed. "I need Robert," he said, when the voice on the other line answered. "Now." There was no panic in his voice, only precision. Because what the airline didn't know was that Malcolm Everett had just been forced off a plane they never should have boarded without his permission. And by the time this call ended, that seat would be the most expensive mistake they ever made. $4 billion. Pull it. All of it. Malcolm's voice didn't waver. The wind outside the terminal tugged at the hem of his coat as he stood just beyond the jet bridge, the weight of humiliation fresh, but buried beneath decades of practiced composure. On the other end of the line, silence reigned for a breath, maybe two, before Robert Gray, CEO of Orion Capital, finally responded. Sir? Are you absolutely sure Malcolm's gaze didn't flicker? Do it now, Robert. I want every cent out of that airline before their wheels leave the tarmac. Inside, flight attendants continued pre-boarding announcements with mechanical smiles, unaware that the fate of their company was already unraveling. Malcolm didn't shout. He never did. He didn't need to. He'd built his empire not on volume, but on precision decades of calculated risks and surgical decisions, all while hiding in plain sight. For the past 12 years, he had stepped away from public view, letting Robert front the firm while he remained the shadow strategist behind some of the most decisive financial power moves on Wall Street. But today, Malcolm Everett stepped out of the shadows, and the world wasn't ready. Robert's voice came back now taut with urgency. Understood. I'm on it. The board will need... They'll get the memo soon enough, Malcolm cut in. Just start the clock. He ended the call and looked up. The clouds above JFK thickened the overcast sky, a mirror of the mood that clung to him like damp air. Around him, no one paid attention. Just another old man with a phone. Just another body moving through the system. He made his way to the parking garage, every step deliberate. Not fast, not slow. Calculated. Each movement echoing the countless briefings he had once given in cold, steel-bellied aircraft, instructing young officers who never knew they were being mentored by a ghost. In the rear pocket of his wallet was an ID that hadn't seen daylight in 20 years. Air Force Captain Malcolm R. Everett, decorated pilot strategic recon, Gulf War veteran. But that world had folded behind him the moment Ruth died. His wife had been his anchor, the one who reminded him that flight had meaning beyond war. She'd loved airports, called them places where destinies cross. She'd died quietly during a routine checkup because the hospital had delayed treatment waiting for insurance clearance. The look in the nurse's eye had said it all. This wasn't a priority. Malcolm never forgot. Not the look, not the room number, not the room, not the silence that followed. That was the moment he disappeared from the world. But now, the world had called him back uninvited, and it would pay for that mistake. As Malcolm pulled out of the parking lot, his phone vibrated again. A message from Robert. Funds in motion. Press already sniffing around. Executives panicking. CNN just called. Malcolm didn't smile. Not yet. This wasn't revenge. It was revelation. This wasn't about money. It was about memory. About reclaiming every moment stolen by assumption and arrogance. He didn't want their apology. He wanted their foundation to tremble so no one else like him would have to carry the burden of invisible dignity. He drove without GPS. He didn't need it. The route home was carved into muscle memory, but halfway down the Belt Parkway, his thoughts drifted back to the girl on the plane, the only person who'd looked at him, not with suspicion, but with question. She couldn't have been older than 9, and in her small, startled voice, she had asked the only honest thing in that cabin. Why are they making the nice man leave? That question echoed louder in his mind than the guard's orders or the smirks of first-class passengers. Malcolm pulled over. For the first time since making the call, he sat still. Really still. The old ticket in his coat crinkled as he leaned forward, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. Ruth. She would have told him to fight smart, to fight clean, to fight forward. And he was. But something still unsettled him. The girl. The silence. The camera phones. The world was watching, but what story would they be told? He started the engine again. Tomorrow they'd find out. They've made a catastrophic mistake. Robert's voice crackled through the speakerphone, panic barely veiled behind the veneer of executive calm. The airline just lost over 11% in stock value within the hour. Bloomberg's running it. CNBC too? Someone leaked the withdrawal. Malcolm stood in the center of his study, a quiet sanctuary lined with military medals, shelves of economic theory, and one framed photograph that stood above them all. Ruth holding a bouquet at the airfield, the last time he saw her smile without pain. He didn't respond immediately. He just watched the headlines scroll across the muted TV screen on the wall. Breaking major, airline loses, key investor. Amid scandal and the ticker below, it read like a confession. They think it's a strategic financial play. Robert added, his voice tightening. They don't know it was personal. Malcolm finally spoke. Let them guess. That's part of their punishment. And it was. Because what these people feared more than financial loss was not knowing who held the blade. Malcolm didn't want them to just lose money. He wanted them to feel lost, uncertain. The same way they had made him feel when they stripped him of dignity for daring to occupy a seat he rightfully earned. The money wasn't revenge, wasn't. It was leverage. The real reckoning was still coming. On the other end, Robert hesitated. You're not done, are you? Malcolm's silence was answer enough. Back at the airline's headquarters, the executives had locked themselves in emergency meetings. Someone had found the footage, a shaky vertical phone video from the young girl's seat. In it, Malcolm stood calmly as he was escorted out. No resistance, no violence, just quiet disbelief. And beside that video, a single caption that was beginning to trend, "This is who you threw off the plane." It wasn't the news outlets that made the clip viral. It was the girl, Emily, and her grandmother. They posted it from her school's parking lot, still confused, still unsettled. He didn't do anything Emily had told a reporter who showed up that evening. He looked kind and tired. The image of a little white girl asking why an old black man was humiliated hit the American conscience like a slap. The questions came fast. Who was he? Why was he removed? Was it racial profiling, ageism, classism, all of it? But still, no one knew the truth. Malcolm watched the chaos swirl from his penthouse, a high rise that looked over the river like a quiet throne. But this wasn't victory. Not yet. Because there was one man still untouched. One man who hadn't flinched or fallen or even acknowledged the incident. The CEO, Cameron Doyle. Sharp-suited, Silicon Valley polished. Publicly praised for modernizing air travel. Privately known for gutting diversity initiatives and union protections. A man who saw people not as passengers, but as profit ratios. Malcolm had done his homework. He knew about Cameron's shell companies, his private investments, the offshore accounts tied to PAC donations and closed-door lobbying. He also knew about the trust fund set aside for a son enrolled in an elite boarding school, a boy who ironically shared a birthday with Malcolm's late wife. That detail struck him hardest, not for its relevance, but for its poetry. Because while Cameron's son studied abroad in Switzerland under private scholarship, Malcolm's wife had sat in a crowded hospital ER, waiting for someone to care. Malcolm opened his drawer, pulled out a small box. Inside was a bronze pin, a pair of wings dulled by time, his old pilot insignia. He ran his thumb across it slowly. The last time he'd worn them was at Ruth's funeral. He hadn't flown since. That day the sky had felt too heavy. He placed the pin on the desk beside the phone. "Robert," he said, calling again. "I want everything on Doyle. Personal, financial, legal. Any pressure points? I'm going to make him feel this. Not through press. Not through politics. Through consequence." "You sure?" Robert asked quietly. Ruth waited for 4 hours in that hospital lobby. No one checked her vitals. They said they were understaffed. They said she wasn't urgent. There was silence. "This isn't vengeance, Robert. This is alignment." And as the call ended and Malcolm looked out over the city, pulsing below, a strange calm settled over him. Not rage, not grief, but resolve. The storm wasn't coming. It had already landed. "I don't want a statement. I want an earthquake." Malcolm's voice cut clean through the phone, crisp, deliberate, as if each syllable were a blueprint. Robert paused on the other end, parsing the weight of that sentence. "How far are you willing to go?" he asked. Malcolm didn't hesitate. Far enough that the next CEO who thinks a man's worth is in his wardrobe remembers this moment for the rest of his career. Across town, inside a glass-paneled boardroom, Glowing with artificial calm, the airline's PR team scrambled. Screens displayed live feeds of media coverage, hashtags piling up by the second Chabriu, EW, first-class justice, fly with dignity. The girl's video had reached 5 million views. Late-night hosts were writing monologues. Advocacy groups were demanding investigations. But the airline's CEO, Cameron Doyle, remained silent. No apology, no address. Only a leaked internal memo advising staff to stay the course. Malcolm read it over Robert's encrypted email with a calm that frightened even him. They still didn't know who they were dealing with. Malcolm stood in the center of his home office, that small bronze pilot pin still resting on his desk. Next to it now was a new object, a sealed envelope marked confidential. Inside, Robert had compiled everything Cameron Doyle's offshore holdings, falsified expense reports, even a quietly buried harassment settlement from his tech startup days. Malcolm scanned the documents not with glee, but with the eyes of a surgeon. There was no pleasure in this, just purpose. He remembered a conversation with Ruth years ago when she told him the scariest kind of power is the one that never raises its voice. He'd spent his life mastering that kind. Now he was going to wield it. The next move had to be precise. Public shame wasn't enough. If he moved too fast, Doyle would spin the narrative, play the martyr, claim politics cancel culture overreach. No, Malcolm needed a weapon with reach and credibility. So he made another call. "Get me Angela Park," he told Robert. "The journalist, ProPublica." Robert's silence was brief. The one who broke the VA discrimination story. Malcolm nodded, though no one could see. "She's the only one who'll dig deep without flinching. And she lost her father to a hospital delay. She'll understand." Later that evening, Malcolm met Angela in a quiet coffee shop downtown. No fanfare, no entourage. Just two people sharing a booth like old friends. He slid the envelope across the table. Her eyes scanned the contents quickly, jaw tightening. "This isn't just scandal," she murmured. "This is federal-level fraud." "And negligence," Malcolm added, voice low. "The kind that hides behind glossy brochures and brand slogans." Angela looked up. "Why now?" He leaned back, eyes steady. "Because no one ever makes them feel it. They get sued, pay a settlement, write a PR script, and keep flying. But this time, I want turbulence. Not for their brand, for their beliefs." That night, Angela filed a preliminary report. Her editor called it career suicide. She called it journalism. By morning, the headline read, "A Billionaire's Quiet War, the Man Behind the 4B Pullout, and What He's Uncovering." The story dropped like a bomb. Suddenly, the conversation shifted. This wasn't just about a man being removed from a seat. It was about the system that told him he never belonged there to begin with. It was about all the boardrooms, hospitals, offices, and gates where dignity was conditional, and people like Malcolm were expected to stay quiet. And still, no word from Doyle. Malcolm knew the silence wouldn't last. Power hates uncertainty. It demands to define the terms. And right now, Doyle had lost control of the narrative. That made him dangerous. Robert called later that afternoon. "We have movement. The board's in panic mode. Investors are calling emergency votes. There's talk of removal if more comes out." Malcolm didn't react. "There will be more," he said simply. He walked back to his study to the glass display case, where Ruth's photo sat beneath the old Air Force pin. He didn't speak. Just stood there, letting the tension settle into his bones. The war had begun. "You thought this was about the seat. It was never about the seat." Malcolm spoke into the recorder slowly, deliberately. His voice didn't carry rage, it carried history. It was for the documentary Angela's team had decided to produce, now that the investigation had widened, subpoenas were flying, and federal regulators were circling like hawks. But Malcolm wasn't interested in camera angles or applause. He was interested in memory, the kind that echoes the kind that outlives you. The story had gone national, no international. The old clip of Malcolm being escorted off the plane had now been viewed over 30 million times. But it wasn't the video that shocked people, it was the aftermath. No one expected the quiet man in the brown coat to be the architect of a financial reckoning. No one imagined he would be the one dragging a corporate titan into the light. And yet, here he was doing what no press team, no activist campaign, no union strike had ever fully achieved, forcing the system to feel what it had taught others to numb. The airline boardroom had fractured. Leaks emerged daily. Whistleblowers were suddenly brave. One anonymous memo detailed internal instructions to minimize elderly and ethnic representation in promotional materials to align with target demographics. It confirmed what Malcolm had known all along. It wasn't personal because he was someone, it was personal because they believed he was no one. Angela's piece had turned the tide. She didn't just tell the story, she traced it. She found old colleagues from Malcolm's military days. Pilots who spoke of his brilliance, his calm under fire the time he landed a wounded aircraft with no landing gear, in the Middle East saving 9 crew members. She interviewed Ruth's sister, who recounted the night Malcolm sat in a hospital corridor for 5 hours, while his wife silently bled, internally dismissed, because she didn't look urgent. The world was beginning to understand, but for Malcolm, understanding wasn't enough. He wanted change that didn't disappear when the camera crews left. He crafted his next move carefully, a public challenge. He would appear live on a national broadcast, not for an interview, but for a testimony. And not about the airline, but about dignity, about systems, about the quiet coded cruelty of modern gatekeeping. Robert had tried to dissuade him. This puts you in the spotlight, Malcolm. It exposes you. Malcolm shook his head. They need to see me, not just hear the numbers or read the quotes. They need to see the man they thought they could erase. 2 days later, Malcolm stepped into the studio. No handlers, no PR spin, no teleprompters. Just him, a chair, and a host who barely knew what to ask. The opening question was soft. Why now? Malcolm didn't blink. Because silence feels safe, until it becomes consent. He spoke for 15 minutes, about class, about race, about age, about the moments we walk past pretending not to see, about the little girl who asked, "Why is the nice man leaving?" and about how no one had an answer, because the answer lived in all of us. The next morning, a surprising email landed in Malcolm's inbox from the grandmother of that little girl, Emily. She wrote, "She keeps asking about you. She's drawing pictures of planes now. She says she wants to grow up and fly people who look like you." Malcolm read the line twice, then once more. His hands didn't tremble, but his heart did. Ruth would have cried. She always believed in children as mirrors of the world we built. Maybe this was how change began, not with rage, but with reflection. But just as that warmth settled in, Robert called with urgent news. "They're moving on, Doyle, but he's not going quietly. He's threatening to leak your military records, claims you're unstable." Malcolm exhaled slowly. Let him. Because Malcolm had one final card to play. One truth left to reveal. And it would be the one thing Doyle never saw coming. "He thinks my silence is shame. It's strategy." Malcolm said it calmly, almost with pity, as he stood by the window of his penthouse, watching the skyline tremble in the distant heat haze. The city was buzzing with speculation. Doyle's allies were retreating political vultures circling above, and yet the man still hadn't resigned. Worse, he'd gone on the offensive. That morning, a tabloid had released excerpts from Malcolm's sealed military records, framing them as the story of a mentally unstable war veteran with abandonment issues and unresolved trauma. They had cherry-picked, twisted, weaponized the wounds of war as if they were disqualifying rather than evidence of survival. Malcolm didn't flinch. He'd expected this. He'd written the cost into his plan, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. He sat down at his desk and opened the full PDF of the leak. It was his past, hollowed out and repackaged for scandal. Mentions of classified psychological debriefs after a mission in Kandahar. Notes from a commanding officer questioning his return to active duty after Ruth's diagnosis. Even an old photo from the base, a younger Malcolm eyes, fierce but fatigued, clutching a folded American flag. He clicked it closed. They were aiming to break him, but they had no idea what he had left to give. That evening, he requested a live response not through press, not through corporate PR, but on a digital platform run by veterans and survivors. No commercials, no edits. Just him. One camera, one truth. When the broadcast began, Malcolm looked directly into the lens. "You've seen my records now," he said, voice steady. "Let me fill in the blanks." He spoke of Kandahar, of the reconnaissance mission, where they lost comms mid-flight and his co-pilot passed out from blood loss. Of the moment he realized he would have to land a failing aircraft on no visibility, in silence, in enemy airspace, with only instinct and memory as his guides. "They say I froze," Malcolm said. "What they left out was that I froze to slow my heart rate, to see the air instead of panic. And I landed us home. All of us." He paused. "They called it a miracle," then filed it away under concerning psychological behavior. Because sometimes survival scares the people who've never had to fight for it. He moved next to Ruth's death, her final hospital visit. The minutes ticking by on a waiting room clock, nurses avoiding eye contact, an intern muttering something about overcapacity. And Ruth, always graceful, whispering, "Let's just go home." She never made it through the night. She died waiting for someone to see her pain. The same way this world teaches you to overlook the quiet ones, the brown ones, the old ones, the ones who don't complain loud enough to be heard. The comments poured in live. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. Veterans saluting. Survivors weeping. Nurses apologizing. Parents thanking him for protecting their children from a future that still looked too much like the past. Malcolm didn't read the comments. He just stared at the lens until it went dark. Robert called minutes later. "It's over," he said. "Doyle's being removed. The board caved. But Malcolm, it's not just about him anymore. You've become the symbol. The industry's shifting under your feet." Malcolm turned his head toward the old pin on his desk. The wings, still untouched, still gleaming softly in the lamplight. "I didn't want to be a symbol," he said quietly. "I just wanted them to understand." Robert's voice dropped. "What now?" Malcolm looked out the window again, the city somehow quieter. A girl's voice echoed in his memory. "Why are they making the nice man leave?" Now he said, "We make sure they never forget why he came back. You burned the plane down. Now build the runway." The words came from Angela, eyes locked with Malcolm across her office desk. Her tone not accusing, but urgent. The expose had finished its arc. Doyle had resigned. The airline's stock had cratered. Congress had issued a public inquiry. But in the aftermath, Malcolm wasn't celebrating. He wasn't relieved. If anything, he looked heavier. As if by bringing the empire down, he'd uncovered a deeper rot he could no longer ignore. The system hadn't failed. It had functioned exactly as designed. "You know what happens now, don't you?" Angela continued. "They'll try to replace him. Rebrand. Reset. Pretend it was just one man, one mistake. But it wasn't." Malcolm nodded slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the pilot wings on the table. "I didn't start this to make an example of Doyle," he said. "I started it because people like Ruth never get justice. Only silence." Outside protests had begun, not angry mobs, but organized crowds. Airline workers, disabled veterans, nurses, elderly passengers. One sign read, "Dignity doesn't board by class." Another, "I am Malcolm." A movement was blooming, but Malcolm knew how fragile moments like this could be. Public outrage once lit burned hot and short. What came next had to outlast the flame. So he met with a group of airline employees, flight attendants, baggage handlers, mechanics, customer service reps, many of whom had reached out after seeing his story. They shared their pain, long hours, racial microaggressions, forced smiles while being screamed at. "We're not the ones making the rules," one said, "but we're the ones who pay for them when it all falls apart." Malcolm listened. For hours. No cameras, No quotes. Just listening. Then he did something no one expected. He called Robert. "I want to start a fund," he said. "Not a donation. Not a charity. A real enforceable independent trust governed by passengers and employees dedicated to airline ethics, frontline safety, and dignity initiatives. I'll seed it with the first $50 million. You bring the rest." Robert, stunned, replied, "You're not trying to kill the airline anymore?" Malcolm's voice was low. Killing the airline was never the goal. Fixing what let it thrive that way is. Angela caught wind of the plan. "You're not just ending a story. You're building an institution," she said. "That makes it permanent." "It makes it accountable," Malcolm corrected. He called it the Runway Project. And just like that, the narrative shifted. People expected vengeance. What they got was structure. What they got was legacy. But not everyone was ready to let it rise. A group of Doyle's former allies launched an anonymous campaign discrediting the fund. Claimed it was a vanity project. Claimed Malcolm had financial motives. Some trolls even mocked Ruth's death. Malcolm didn't respond, not publicly. But that night, he walked to the airfield outside the city, the same one where he and Ruth had once flown together in an old two-seater. The hangar was still there, rusted, empty. He sat on a bench nearby as dusk rolled in. He took the pin from his coat, holding it against the last light. "I wasn't supposed to survive that landing in Kandahar," he whispered, voice almost a prayer. "But I did. Maybe because someone knew this flight was still coming." His phone buzzed. It was Emily's mother. "She wrote you a letter. She says you're the reason she wants to be brave." Malcolm's hands tightened around the phone. He stared at the horizon. If this was the runway, then the next flight had to carry everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. "This time, I'm taking everyone with me." Malcolm whispered the words to himself as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. The airport was the same one he'd been dragged from just weeks earlier. But now, something fundamental had shifted. Not in the building. Not in the lighting or the uniforms or even the policies, though some of those had quietly changed. No, what shifted was in him. The silence he once carried like a wound had become a weapon. And today, it was becoming something even greater, a legacy. He walked toward Gate 42A, where a special flight was preparing to depart, an inaugural flight operated by a partnership between the newly restructured airline and the Runway Project. Every person on the manifest had been chosen deliberately, a disabled veteran, a black flight attendant who once faced suspension for wearing her natural hair, an elderly couple who had been bumped from first class to coach without apology, a teenage girl with a heart condition whose family had been denied boarding because of a ticketing error. Malcolm didn't walk ahead of them. He walked among them. As the boarding door opened, the new captain, a young Latina woman who'd read Malcolm's testimony 3 times, extended her hand to him. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, eyes shining. He smiled gently. "It's good to be back in the sky." Inside the plane looked no different to the casual eye, but small things told a new story. Signage in multiple languages, seats labeled with pronouns of choice. Safety cards with illustrations featuring passengers of all races and ages. And in seat 1A, there was a handwritten note taped to the headrest. Reserved for anyone who's ever been told to sit at the back. Malcolm took his seat quietly, running his hand over the leather armrest, remembering the texture, the stillness of ascent, the hum of clarity when wheels leave the earth. For years, he had thought his days of flying were over, that whatever had once lifted him had long since landed. But Ruth had always said, "You don't stop flying. You just stop thinking it's only for the sky." Outside the window, the crowd at the terminal watched. Some had come to protest, some to witness, some simply to feel something bigger than their own day. On one of the signs, he taught us the altitude of dignity. Angela was there too, standing quietly in the corner, holding a microphone, not to record, but just in case someone else needed to speak. The engines roared to life. As the aircraft rolled onto the tarmac, Malcolm closed his eyes. Not in fear, in reverence. Because this wasn't the end of the journey. It was liftoff. And somewhere in a tiny living room in Ohio, Emily sat cross-legged beside her grandmother, clutching a toy airplane with ME scribbled on the side. She looked up at the screen where the plane began to ascend and said, "That's Mr. Malcolm's plane. One day, I'll build one too." Back in the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled through the cabin. "We are now cleared for takeoff. To those flying with us today, thank you. This flight is dedicated to those who never stop believing in a better sky." Malcolm looked down at the pin in his palm, his old wings now repolished, glinting in the morning sun. He fastened his seatbelt, leaned back, and whispered one last time, "Let's fly."